G'day, AJ Mahara here. On the topic of people who are in relationships with people with borderline personality disorder, especially chosen relationships, and codependency. And the fact is that even in unchosen relationships and family relationships, somebody can have BPD, and lots of people can, in a family system can also have codependency. Codependency has had many various different definitions over the decades, but essentially, even in its beginning or beginning of understanding, many moons ago, that people who had codependence or were codependent were the people that enabled people, with substance or alcohol abuse. It's interesting because I think if you take that one key piece out of that puzzle and expand codependency to what it really more so is, yes, there's a lot of enabling in people with codependency, and there's also a lot of boundary issues that people with codependency have. So codependency begins in childhood, and also it has very many ways that can come about, but codependency is a response to adverse childhood experience in its own right. Perhaps not to the same degree that borderline personality disorder is a response to adverse childhood experience. But the thing that's really important to remember, and I've just, watched a couple of videos today with people that talk about BPD and frankly don't know what they're talking about. Couple different YouTubers. There's many of them out there, and of course there's many who know what they're talking about, right? But it's really difficult to listen to somebody say, in answering the question, what is borderline personality? They basically name off the other cluster B and a few cluster A and C personality disorders and said that's what it is. They named off 10 personality disorders and said that's what BPD is. Like, that's just frankly lunacy. And then, that one YouTuber that lots of people enjoy, that I think is very creative and helps people in his own way. I've watched some of his videos, and especially watched when he talks about BPD and things of that nature. And he said everything from, he sat down with Bachman, who said BPD is psychosis, which is not true. And then he said, or for most people, and it certainly isn't just psychosis, or people would not be diagnosed with BPD, they'd be diagnosed with a psychotic disorder. And then I saw him, again, not to pick on him, not that it matters, like he does a lot of good stuff. But then I saw him in another video say, well, 90% of people that are diagnosed with BPD really have CPTSD anyway. So all these off-the-cuff comments that are contradictory. And then I saw another video of his, I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was more along the lines of, the usual, people with BPD, this, that, the other, can't get better, blah, 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 blah. Sort of psychiatry speak. And then a recent video on his new Fortress Mental Health System something or other, whatever that is. He said, when he's talking about CPTSD, which he does a fine job about in most ways, but when he's talking about that, then he says, he's not talking about personality disorders here because they are personal, pervasive, and permanent. And yet he has, on his other main channel, made so many arguments against, is NPD really a personality disorder? Because that's just one example of one YouTuber on one topic, which he doesn't really speak on a lot. Lots of people are doing this. And it's sort of like one video, it's like one way. One next video, it's the next way. And I saw somebody trying to answer the question, which I'm not going to do in this video, but I could, but maybe for another time. What does it mean that people with BPD don't have a self? Well, it means a lot, and they're living basically through a false self. So what is this sort of, I don't really mean it, I was going to say alliance between people with BPD and people with codependency, or people who identify as empaths, because an empath is still, having a lot of empathy is a wonderful thing, but not when it's hurting you, and not when it keeps you in a relationship where you're being hurt. And I think also there's a big cultural aspect to this too, which is that we are being gaslit in the macrocosm by narcopathic corporatocracy, plutocracy, and, those who rule the world, so to speak. And so everything is kind of like is your entertainment, not just for you, but is your entertainment being delivered to you, whether it's a movie, music, whatever, to distract you from what's really going on? Because now we see that, mainstream media doesn't even really deliver necessarily what's really going on in the world, or they pick and choose, or they have angles. Everything that used to be news, or we thought used to be news, who knows back then, that was factual. Today, these things aren't factual. They're just kind of like everybody's opinion. So it's really difficult in a really crowded internet with people talking about a lot of the same topics. I'm not here to say I got it all that, perfect or whatever. But having had BP and having recovered and knowing how possible that is, knowing how dauntingly difficult it is, but knowing how possible it is, and I keep coming back to the question of, I talk a lot about here, for people who've been hurt by someone with BPD, yes. But the thing is, what is this dance between the codependent and a person with BPD? Because you see, it becomes a dyad, and it becomes a situation then where everything just isn't the person with BPD's fault or responsibility, or alone, it's not just their fault and responsibility. So whatever's going on with somebody with BPD, everybody's different with BPD. What's going on with people with codependency? So I'm here to say in this video podcast to ask yourself, if you haven't already, and likely you have, and maybe you're getting to it, or maybe you've been working on it a lot. Why do you think, if you have codependency, or maybe you don't like the word, but if you have what it really means, that, somebody could cheat on you, somebody could be treating you really poorly, and it's not a deal breaker to you. You don't have sort of the healthy enough boundaries. And people with codependency tend to want to people please, rescue, some play the hero role. And all of that is just going to end up in feeling, rather annihilated. Maybe not like people with BPD feel annihilated, but it just, all the helping and all the giving and all the people pleasing and all the enabling in the world, and all the love you try to give, and all the kindness and all the overgiving. People with BPD have substantial wounds that need to be delved into in therapy, and they can be healed. But unless and until they do that work, and if you're in a relationship right now, it's not working out, don't expect them to be able to get that work done to save your relationship. And the other thing I think people with codependency need to think a little bit more about, and I say this with empathy, is that you need your own healing and recovery journey. I've had so many clients, they ask me all kinds of, some similar pattern questions, but it's understandable because the experiences have some similar core common patterns to them when you're in relationships with people with BPD. But I do get asked a lot of questions that linger for people, understandably, after a relationship with somebody with BPD that really was painful, that ended in a horrible, painful way. And it's sort of like always the focus is on the person with BPD. Okay, I understand that, but at what point do people realize, if you have codependency, or you've been in a relationship with somebody with BPD and maybe you don't like the word codependency, or you haven't really got there yet, or realized that yet, or you don't want to look at it that way, then ask yourself, why do you keep focusing on this person, especially if the relationship's been over for couple of years or more. It takes time to heal this unhealthy bonded fit, which, really isn't a fit, but it is a fit of sorts. It's not a healthy fit between people with BPD and people who have codependency. What you need to know more about yourself if you have codependency in your relationship, and you're in a relationship with someone with BPD, or you're involved with somebody with BPD in your family in this codependent, helping, rescuer, enabling, trying to fix way, what is it that you're not looking at inside yourself? Why is it that you don't value yourself a little bit more than that, or a whole lot more than that? And why is it that rather than take care of yourself and find happiness and look through what's still hurting you and what hurt you in childhood, that you would rather continue to remain in your own woundedness from childhood and try to help somebody that you really effectively can't help with BPD instead of helping yourself. So, not an easy message here that for people with codependency in relationships with people with BPD, but what we have there, besides the obvious of what BPD is and how difficult that can be, not only for the people with BPD, but people relating to them or in relationship to them with codependency, or whether you accept that term or whatever you might think is the reason that you're in this compelling situation that is really affecting your life in many negative ways. What we have is people with BPD have codependency too. So people with BPD are often, I'm not going to say every single person, but most people with BPD have codependence as well, because it is a response to adverse childhood experience as well. And it's just one response. And so people with BPD often have a more extreme or deeper woundedness in adverse childhood experience. And that's kind of what BPD is really a descriptor of, more than what the pseudoscience of psychiatry says it is. And so there's codependency in people with BPD. And then there's people with codependency who don't have BPD. And yet, some people with BPD can be really giving at times, or trying hard. And it's going to be out of their codependency. Often, though, it's out of their learned helplessness and their neediness. And let me just say, a neediness that is understandable because they didn't get their needs met in childhood at all. And then people with codependency often don't realize, because it's a wound. It's a very substantial wound in childhood. You know, the roots of codependency, adverse childhood experience response as well. But people don't lose themselves totally, or, don't lose themselves like people with BPD do. In a way, it's like, it's a match, it's a fit, but it's not a healthy fit or a healthy match. And what's happening for the person with BPD and the object of the relations, they're looking for the parent that they didn't have. They're looking to get needs met that a parent didn't meet, because subconsciously there's still that split off from ego aspect of child. And for people with codependency, there's a really wounded inner child that isn't fragmented off and totally split away from, but doesn't get much attention in most people's lives unless they enter a healing recovery process for codependency, which many people do after relationships with people with BPD or narcissists. But the thing is, in the meantime, a lot of the communication in the relationship is going to, or lack of communication, and a lot of the confusion, a lot of the conflict is going to be driven, doesn't matter really who starts what, but it's going to be a mix of what people with BPD are struggling with, but also what people with BPD with their codependency are struggling with, and what codependents are struggling with. And the other thing that people with codependency have to realize is that the more you give to somebody with BPD, most people, not all, the more you give to them, the more they're going to push you away. Because the very thing that they want, this is really one of the dilemmas for people with BPD, it's very painful. The more that they want to be close, the more that they want to be loved. And they do want to love too, but they really don't know how to do that yet. Unless and until they've had enough treatment, and substantial treatment, to undo the reasons why that is the case for many with BPD. So the more you love them, and you're loving them because, codependents need to do that over giving, because that's what you learned in childhood. That was how maybe you got a drop from a parent of attention, or maybe that's how you got seen once in a while by a parent who otherwise wasn't emotionally available. So codependency in childhood for codependents comes from things like maybe substance addicted parents, who may well have a personality disorder or not. Comes from not being seen, not being heard, not being valued, not being a parent, not being emotionally available for you. And then what happens is that you get wounded as a child, you can be parentified as a child, and all of the interplay between people with codependency and people with borderline personality disorder goes to the heart of the sort of chaotic need on both sides. Not saying it's the same or to the same level, but the same need to be seen, And a codependent often will have that need to be seen. They will enact that by being kind, caring, and overgiving, and rescuing, and excusing everything that somebody else does. And a person with BPD can't meet a person with codependency in that place, because people with BPD really need to learn limits and boundaries. And if you don't have any limits and boundaries, or very few, or you don't enforce them, it's the dyad, it's the interactions that then multiply everything. But I'm not trying to say it's equal. But this is just to say to people with codependency that you're hurting too. And then you place yourself in the road, in the way of people with BPD we're going to act in or act out, and they're really acting in or acting out still unresolved childhood experience and woundedness from childhood. And they're going to do that to the person closest to them. And then the codependent is essentially doing something else to the person closest to them in a different way. So it's not so simplistic as to say that people with BPD are always doing the negative, bad, horrible things, though they can be doing things that really hurt people and that hurt themselves at the same time. But people with codependency are always trying to do the building up and the fixing. And what you need to realize about that is that people with BPD can be quite lost, because it's a lot of pain they're carrying from their childhoods. And they didn't ask for that. They don't deserve that. And then that point about once you become adult age, if you have BPD, it becomes your responsibility. Nothing fair about that. It's just that you need to find your way, if you have BPD, to radically accepting that so you can move forward, so you can get help, so you can feel better, and you can relate better to yourself first and then to others. And people with codependency need to realize that there's something in this for you too. Aside from what you might think consciously, obviously, you're attracted to somebody, you want this relationship to work out. But what a lot of codependents don't realize is that they too, in a different way, for different reasons, to a different degree, are looking for that unavailable parent in the person with BPD. And the person with BPD, to a more, infantile level of defenses, is looking for the same in object-other relations back to the person with codependency. This is why it's a recipe for disaster. And the disaster is not just caused. The way a relationship ends, one may say, well, hey, the person with BPD really was the worst in the relationship. And, I'm not going to say, well, one is always worse and one's always better. The thing is the interplay. And what's happening there is really the person with BPD with no sense of self and a split off, fragmented child ego state, and a person with codependency with a really wounded or to different degrees wounded inner child. So there's a whole lot going on in the substrata of your psychology, of your psyche. There's a whole lot going on subconsciously on both people's part, the person with BPD and the codependent. So there's enough woundedness to go around. And then the interactions, I really believe everybody tries their absolute best. But people are, until and unless you get the therapy that you need if you have BPD, the healing recovery journey that you need if you have codependency, you're going to keep playing out common patterns from your childhood. Different, I'm not saying it's the same, but the person with BPD will and the codependent will, and then it's going to be this sort of like really unhealthy, quote, fit, unquote. So it's important that people with codependency don't just always focus on what person with BPD said, did, didn't do, because really you're getting triggered back yourself with codependency to a primal core wound in yourself from your own childhood, and it might not be as deep or as pervasive as that of people with BPD. But I just want to say to what one YouTuber said off the cuff, personality disorders, lots of them, because what are they anyways? Like, seriously, aside from psychopathy and, malignant narcissism and things of that nature, there's a lot of personality disorders in cluster A and C, and borderline personality is one of these too, where they're really not defined in any helpful way so that they can be more effectively treated and less stigmatized. And it's about time that that really happens. And so I think it's really important to look at the dyad, and it's really important for hopefully the person with BPD when relationships end to do that work and to be in therapy. It's really important, equally important for different reasons, and maybe not to the same degree for people with codependency to do that work and to look at what it's sort of your motivation. What is your motivation under the motivation that you're consciously aware of right now? It needs more consideration, and people all over the internet, I understand that they are really hurt by people with BPD. People with BPD are really hurting. People with BPD get into relationships with narcissists and psychopaths as well as others and codependents, and so there's enough hurt to go around. And instead of vilifying everybody, sometimes you have to just step back and look. People really need to in their lives. And of course, if people with BPD don't have that awareness yet or that insight, it makes it really difficult. But what is it about this culture now, an intergenerational adverse childhood experience, that doesn't just result in a diagnosis of BPD or, but codependency or even CPTSD, things that psychiatry doesn't recognize, and therefore people are like, well, some clinicians are like, it isn't really valid if it isn't in that stupid DSM Bible of psychiatry, the pseudoscience of psychiatry. So my message here is simply, that each person really needs to take a look at themselves, be in your own healing and recovery journey. And I mean, I do work with people with BPD, and I do work with people who've been in relationships with somebody with BPD or a narcissist or a psychopath or somebody with different personality disorder combinations. And what that really means, though, and if you have codependency, then you need to look at what you need to know more about yourself. And so, if I resonate with you, I'm out here to help you with that work. Family of origin, for people with codependency, family of origin healing, self-differentiation, and inner child healing. And for people with BPD, it's a whole lot, but it's some of that as well. But before you can even get to self-differentiation, doing family of origin work, which is in the backdrop of looking at and helping somebody in their recovery from BPD. But you first have to find the split off, fragmented from ego state of child. You first have to find the lost child in BPD inside of yourself, because that's the way to finding out who you really are. And that's the way to healing and recovery. And in the meantime, what is it about our society that keeps people thinking that, quote, love, unquote, is worth fighting for? That love, in quotes, is this conflict and this chaos and this tumult and so painful. Because that's what people have learned in their childhoods. I mean, that's what I learned in my childhood too. I had to unlearn that in recovery. 3 decades ago now, when I recovered from BPD, I had to unlearn that and learn a whole lot of other things I didn't learn in a narcissistic dysfunctional family of origin. So there's that going on. Personality disorders, when we're talking about BPD, when we're talking about some in cluster C and a couple in cluster A, they don't have to be pervasive, permanent. These are common patterns among human beings who share, not the same always, but with variables and individual circumstances, adverse childhood experience that arrest emotional development. And so if anybody thinks on this channel that I'm here to vilify people with BPD, I'm not. And I think that this dance between codependence, people with BPD, if you're in a place where you can take more personal responsibility and you want to grow, great. If you're not there yet, well, hopefully you will awaken to that sooner rather than later for yourself, so that you can, not hurt so much and be in so much suffering. And for people with codependency, there are really hard choices to make, but to think that you can rescue somebody with BPD, no offense to people with BPD, nobody can rescue anybody in that sense. If somebody's drowning, you might have a chance to literally pull them out of the water, but you can't rescue somebody from their own emotional pain and unresolved issues from their childhood. And that's what really therapy is effective for. And so the answer, like some YouTubers out there are saying too, it's not a quick fix. It's not about just NLP anchoring is going to change your life in, a month or something. That's unrealistic. And I know people gravitate to that message and the entertainment factor of some YouTubers with that. But I keep it real here. Maybe it's too serious all the time. But so there is a dance between codependents and people with BPD who also have codependency. So it's really important. My message here, just to end, is each has to take responsibility for themselves and to realize that no matter how compelling the relationship is, the feelings you have for each other might be, or for people with BPD are sometimes and aren't other times, you need to both realize that you're relating to that other person from, in the case of people with BPD, a not even known inner child, a fragmented, split off child ego state. In the case of people with codependency, from a wounded inner child. It is the dynamics in your subconscious that's driving this feeling, and that becomes reality for people in relationships with people with BPD and codependence on both sides. It becomes this, well, this has got to be the person for me. And what would I do without this person? And this has to work out. And there's where you lay down traps for yourself on either side of the equation. And so it's really about the personal responsibility that every single human being needs to learn to take for themselves if they haven't already. Because you have to learn to find your own way, and you have to know who you are. And you don't have to, but I mean, it benefits people. The only way to healthy relating and relationships and being able to let go of what isn't working, and hopefully in a more kind way than often I hear a lot of people with BPD and relationships, each person has to chart their own course and first be an individual. Because if you want to get to healthy relating, healthy relationships are interdependent. They're not codependent, they're not counterdependent, they're interdependent. And to have an interdependent healthy relationship, that means whether you have BPD now and you're working on recovery, or you haven't yet and you got to get into that, or you have codependency, each side has more healing to do in different ways for different reasons, to be more independent and to break away from the patterns of the adverse childhood experiences and the really painful childhoods that are had by many more of us than not. Take care.